My name is Eleanor Hayes and I am 65 years old. I was born and raised on the wide, wind-beaten plains of Montana, where the sky swallows everything and the land tests you every day of your life. Out here, you learn early that nothing comes easy. Rain doesn't fall when you want it. Cattle don't stay in their pens, and crops don't grow out of pity. You take what you can earn, and you learn to stand your ground. Through all of that, there was one person who never let me forget who I was: my sister Margaret. She was 3 years older, but she felt like a lifetime ahead of me. Sharp, witted, stubborn, with a laugh so bold it could chase away the worst kind of loneliness. I can still see us as little girls, barefoot in the vineyard our uncle once tended. We weren't supposed to touch the grapes, but Margaret would pluck them off the vines anyway. Pop one in her mouth, then hand me another, grinning with purple juice running down her chin. She'd tip that wide straw hat low across her eyes and say, "Eleanor, this land is ours. Doesn't matter what anyone else says." She was right. She always was. That's why, even when I grew older, married, raised a daughter of my own, it was Margaret who stood beside me when everything else fell apart. Through divorce, through debt, through the long winters when the bank threatened foreclosure and the pipes froze solid. She was my anchor, and now she was gone. The day of her funeral, the church smelled of lilies and dust. Her casket sat at the altar, framed by sunlight slanting through stained glass. Beside it was her photograph, the one of her laughing in that same straw hat, holding a basket of grapes like she was welcoming the world to sit at her table. I should have been allowed to grieve her in peace. But peace isn't something my daughter has ever allowed me. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and in walked Sophie Hayes. It had been 9 years since I had last seen her. 9 years since she told me I had failed her, slammed the door, and vanished into a life I only heard about in whispers. Failed businesses, restless moves from one city to the next, debts mounting like storm clouds. She never called. Not when her father Richard died. Not on my birthdays. Not even when Margaret fell ill. And yet here she was, walking straight down the aisle in black slacks and a crimson blazer, her chin lifted high as though she were walking into a courtroom. Instead of her aunt's funeral, she didn't even look at me. Not at first. Instead, she turned to face the crowd, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floor, and raised her hand toward me like she was delivering a sentence. "This woman," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "is nothing but a parasite." Gasps rippled through the church. Someone in the front pew let out a low cry. Even Father Thomas froze with his Bible half raised. Sophie's words echoed off the rafters, growing louder, bolder, as if she'd been rehearsing them for years. "She does not deserve a single acre of this land. Not one cow. Not 1 cent of what Aunt Margaret built. She never worked for it. She never cared about it. And she certainly doesn't deserve the Cadillac or the $2 million left behind. This land belongs to me. To our family." I saw Daniel Reed, the ranch manager who had worked under Margaret for more than 2 decades, bow his head in disbelief. A woman I'd known since childhood, Mrs. Callahan, who once baked pies for Sophie when she was a girl, shook her head slowly, her lips pressed thin with shame. But Sophie didn't stop. She went on, her voice shaking not with grief but with fury. She turned her back on her own daughter. When I needed her help, she abandoned me. When I begged for a chance, she slammed the door in my face. And now she thinks she can stand here and collect everything like she earned it. No, she's nothing but a fraud. Each word was a fist. I felt them land, on my chest, my throat, my heart. But I refused to flinch. Because in that moment, as my daughter tried to dismantle me in front of 100 witnesses, I remembered the little girl she used to be. I remembered Sophie at 6 years old, chasing calves across the pasture, her hair wild, her laughter louder than the cows bawling. I remembered her at 10, curled up in my lap during thunderstorms, whispering that she wanted to be brave like Aunt Margaret. I remembered her at 16, slamming the door after I refused to buy her a car, shouting that I was trying to hold her back. And then I remembered her at 25, standing in my kitchen, asking me for $30,000 to fund Todd's latest business scheme. I had told her no. The numbers didn't make sense, and the risk was too great. She had looked at me with fire in her eyes and said words I'll never forget. "You failed me as a mother." That was the day she walked out of my life. Until now. Until the day she stood in a church and called me a parasite. When she finally stopped, the silence that followed was suffocating. No one knew what to say. Some looked at me with pity, others with doubt, but all of them stared. That's when Daniel stepped forward, steady as the land itself, and laid a hand gently on my elbow. "Let's sit, Eleanor," he whispered. But I shook my head. I needed to stand. I needed to hear it all. Because once she was done, the silence would belong to me. I turned toward Margaret's photograph. The straw hat, the laughter, the crinkled eyes that had seen me through every storm. And I whispered inside my own heart, "I heard you, sister, and I won't let her take this from us." That was the beginning. The first strike in a battle I never asked for, but could no longer avoid. And as the last hymn played and the casket was carried out, I knew one thing with startling clarity. Sophie hadn't come back for family. She had come back for conquest. And she was about to learn what happens when you declare war on a woman who has nothing left to lose. That evening, after the mourners drifted away and the last notes of the organ faded, I stayed behind in the empty church. The lilies by Margaret's casket had begun to wilt, their sweet smell turning heavy in the air. I straightened her photograph one last time, brushing my fingers over the glass. For a moment I almost whispered aloud to her, almost begged her to tell me how to survive what had just happened. But Margaret was gone. The answers would have to come from me. By the time I returned to the ranch house, the sun had slipped behind the hills. The yard was still, the cattle quiet in their pens, the gravel lot empty except for one unfamiliar car. Inside the kitchen, at the old oak table, sat Maxwell Thornton, Margaret's attorney. He rose when I entered, tall and lean, his silver hair combed back, his expression sharp but not unkind. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "your sister made her wishes clear. I'm here to honor them." I sat across from him, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The table between us was covered in manila folders, stamped documents, and envelopes sealed in Margaret's unmistakable cursive handwriting. My chest tightened at the sight. Maxwell adjusted his glasses and began to read. "As per the last will and testament of Margaret Ann Hayes, all land assets, livestock, personal property, and cash holdings are hereby transferred in full to my sister, Eleanor Grace Hayes. I entrust her to preserve this land, as I know she carries its roots in her bones." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I heard the words, but they felt distant, echoing as though from underwater. Margaret had trusted me with everything. Every acre, every cow, every dollar. Not because I wanted them, but because she believed I would protect them. Maxwell slid a sealed envelope across the table. "From Margaret," he said quietly. I recognized the slanted handwriting instantly. My throat ached. "I'll read it later," I whispered. He nodded, then folded his hands. "Your sister anticipated resistance. She made this will airtight. Every clause checked, every signature witnessed. No one has standing to contest it, not legally." I gave a bitter laugh. "You don't know my daughter." Maxwell's eyes sharpened. "I know enough, and I can tell you, Mrs. Hayes, this was not the last wave." He gathered his folders, tipped his hat politely, and left me alone with the silence. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. The papers were mine, the land was mine, but the victory was hollow. Sophie's words still clung to the walls of my chest like smoke after a fire. The next morning, Daniel Reed arrived at dawn with coffee and 2 croissants from the bakery in town. We sat on the porch as the fog rolled off the fields like steam rising from a kettle. Neither of us spoke at first. The quiet between us had never been uncomfortable. Finally, Daniel said, "She meant every word of that will, Eleanor. Margaret trusted you." I nodded. But trust didn't stop the ache. It didn't stop the dread curling low in my stomach. By noon, Maxwell returned with more documents. Titles, deeds, insurance policies. I signed page after page, my hands stiff, my mind elsewhere. When it was done, Maxwell looked up at me. "As of this morning, all holdings are in your name." Before I could answer, there was a knock at the door. A uniformed courier stood on the porch, a packet of papers in his hand. He asked for my signature, then left without a word. I opened the envelope at the kitchen sink. Inside were legal motions filed by Sophie's attorney, petition to delay asset transfer, motion to freeze estate distribution, demand for immediate reconsideration of will execution. All signed, all aggressive. I stared at the pages, my hands trembling. Sophie hadn't wasted a single day. I picked up the phone and dialed Maxwell. "She's trying to freeze everything," I said. He didn't hesitate. "I'll file the response before midnight. She has no standing. She wasn't in the will, wasn't a contributor, wasn't even present during your sister's illness." This is noise. Nothing more. But it didn't feel like noise. It felt like the first crack of thunder before a storm. I hung up, walked out the back door, and followed the dirt path Margaret and I had walked every spring. I could still hear her voice, young and certain. This land will outlast us, Eleanor. But only if we fight for it. And as I stood there, the petition still fresh in my hand, I realized something with bone, deep clarity. My daughter wasn't coming for reconciliation. She was coming for liquidation, and I was the only wall standing in her way. The kitchen was quiet after Maxwell left, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet Margaret and I used to share on early mornings, waiting for the kettle to whistle. It was a heavy quiet, one that pressed down on my chest and made the ticking of the wall clock sound like a hammer. I stared at the sealed envelope on the table. Margaret's handwriting, steady, slanted, unmistakable. Just seeing it made my throat close. For years we'd left each other notes on the fridge, on fence posts, even on the dashboard of the old Cadillac. Sometimes they were practical. Don't forget to mend the south gate. Other times they were teasing. Don't eat all the pie before I get home. That handwriting was more familiar to me than my own reflection. But I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. Instead, I walked to the window. The vineyard stretched out under the setting sun, rows of vines bending in the wind, the soil dark and damp from last week's rain. It was beautiful and endless, but it felt heavier than ever before. It wasn't just land now. It was burden. It was inheritance. It was Margaret's final word. I pressed my hand against the glass and let my mind wander back to our last conversation. It had been late, just a week before she passed. I sat by her hospital bed while the machines hummed, and she looked at me with those sharp eyes dulled by pain, but still filled with fire. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice raw, "promise me something." I leaned close, gripping her hand. "Anything. Don't let Sophie tear this place apart. I know she'll try. I can see it in her. But this land isn't just acres and cattle. It's memory. It's proof we survived. Promise me." I had promised, though part of me thought it was fevered talk. The way people near the end often cling to fears that may never come. But now, holding the legal petitions in my hand, I realized Margaret had seen more clearly than any of us. She had known Sophie would come. She had known Sophie would strike hard and fast. That night, I set the unopened letter on the nightstand beside my bed. I lay awake listening to the old house creak, the cattle shifting in the pens, the distant wind moving through the fields. I thought about Sophie as a child, her tiny hand wrapped around mine, the way she used to call me Mama, strong like a bull, after watching me lift feed bags twice my size. I thought about how quickly admiration had soared into resentment. And I asked myself the question that had haunted me for years. Had I failed her, or had she simply chosen to fail me? The next morning, the answer arrived in a courier's envelope, cold and legal. Petitions, motions. Threats on paper. I read them twice. My stomach churning, then called Maxwell. His voice was calm, practiced, reassuring. "Noise," he said. "Just noise. I'll respond tonight." But it didn't feel like noise. It felt like the start of war drums. After the call, I walked outside into the biting Montana air. The wind tugged at my shawl as I followed the dirt path down toward the south fields. I passed the irrigation shed where Margaret and I once patched pipes with duct tape and laughter. I passed the old oak where Sophie used to sit with a book when she was 12. Too proud to help with chores, but too afraid to stray far from me. At the edge of the vineyard, I stopped and closed my eyes. For a moment I could almost hear Margaret's voice. "Stand still, Eleanor. Let the storm wear itself out, then plant again." But this storm wasn't going to wear itself out. This storm had Sophie's name written all over it. And I knew she wouldn't stop until she either had what she wanted or was broken by the truth. I turned back toward the house, the petition still burning in my hand, and I felt the first hardening of resolve settle deep in my bones. This wasn't just about land. This was about love twisted into greed. This was about legacy. And if my daughter wanted to fight, she would find that her mother had more fight left in her than she ever imagined. 2 days passed before the storm finally arrived at my door. The petitions Sophie had filed were still fresh in my mind, but I hadn't heard from her directly since the funeral. I spent those days walking the fields with Daniel, reviewing harvest schedules, checking fences, and going through Margaret's old ledgers. It was work that steadied me. The rhythm of boots on soil, the low hum of cattle, the smell of earth after dawn. But beneath it all, I felt the tension building like pressure in the air before a thunderclap. And then, without warning, I saw her. Through the kitchen window, I caught sight of Sophie stepping out of a sleek black car, her heels crunching against the gravel. She wore a wine-colored blazer. Her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was no hesitation in her walk. She climbed the porch steps as if she owned them. I opened the door before she could knock. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled the curtains behind me, and the house felt smaller with her standing there, so close yet so foreign. She finally broke the silence. Still the same curtains, she said, her eyes sweeping over the familiar kitchen behind me. Still smells like wet books and regret. Her words cut, but I didn't flinch. I only stepped aside, and she entered as though she owned the air itself. She didn't sit. She paced the room like an attorney addressing a jury. Then she stopped in front of me, eyes sharp, voice steady. "You think this is over? You think a signature from Margaret and a piece of paper makes you queen of all this?" I crossed my arms. 8 years, Sophie. 8 years you were gone. You never called. Not once. Not when your father died, not when Margaret was sick. Not even when you knew I was here alone. She smiled, slow and bitter. I was building something real. I didn't need your pity. Then she pulled a set of papers from her purse and slapped them onto the table. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over half the land. Not all, just half. That's fair. And the cattle. I know a buyer who'll take the hurt off your hands. You won't even have to lift a finger." I looked down at the papers. Contracts neatly typed, spaces already marked for my signature. She had come prepared, confident. My voice was calm. "No," she blinked. "Excuse me." "No," I repeated, her jaw locked, the smile sliding from her face. "I gave you a chance to do this the easy way." I stepped forward, closing the space between us. My voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "You gave me nothing, Sophie. You walked away, you erased me. And now you stand in your aunt's house demanding the land she left in my care. This place doesn't belong to you. It never did." For a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Not regret, not even hurt, but calculation. She softened her tone, tilting her head like she used to when she wanted something as a child. "Mom," she said quietly, "let's not fight. We can work together. You don't have the background to run this place. I can help." I reached for the papers, but not to sign them. I carried them across the room, opened the fireplace grate, and dropped them onto the embers. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges black, the ink dissolving into ash. Sophie stared, her face lit by the fire. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She just turned sharply on her heel and walked out the door. The sound of her heels on the porch echoed like gunshots. But I knew one thing with bone, deep certainty: she wasn't done. Sophie wasn't my daughter anymore. She was a storm, and I was finished seeking shelter. Sophie did not come back the next day or the one after that. The ranch was quiet again, too quiet. I tried to tell myself maybe she had finally realized the fight was over, but deep down, I knew my daughter. Sophie never left empty-handed. If she couldn't win in person, she'd find another way. It came 3 mornings later, in the form of Ellen Price, an old friend of Margaret's and a retired judge who had known our family since childhood. She pulled into the driveway with a bag of peaches under her arm, her jaw set tight. I knew that look. "You need to see this," she said, stepping into the kitchen. She slid her phone across the table. On the screen was a blog post, slick, polished, and poisonous. The headline made my stomach drop. "Local retiree inherits vineyard. Freezes out real hair." Beneath it, a grainy photo of me leaving the courthouse, head down, sunglasses on. It made me look guilty, sneaky, like I was hiding something. I scrolled down. The words blurred, but I forced myself to read. It claimed I had manipulated Margaret in her final months, convinced her to rewrite the will while she was weak, exploited her grief after her husband's death, and cut Sophie, the true heir, out of her rightful inheritance. Not a word of it was true. But every line was sharp enough to wound. I set the phone down slowly. My hands were shaking. "She wants a war," I said quietly. Ellen's lips pressed thin. "And she wants to win it in the court of public opinion, before the law catches up." Later that afternoon, I found Daniel Reed in the equipment shed, his hands black with grease as he worked on a broken pressure valve. I handed him the phone. He wiped his palms on his jeans and read the post in silence. When he finished, he met my eyes. "She's going for your throat." I straightened my shoulders. "Let her." Daniel studied me for a long moment, then nodded. He didn't argue. That was his way. But when I was alone again that evening, sitting at Margaret's desk with the glow of the lamp flickering over stacks of legal folders, the weight of it pressed down hard. Sophie wasn't just trying to take the land anymore. She was trying to erase me in the eyes of everyone who mattered. Neighbors, workers, even the community Margaret and I had built our lives around. I pulled open the top drawer and found the sealed envelope again. Margaret's letter. My hands shook as I broke the seal and unfolded the paper. Her handwriting stared back at me, strong and deliberate. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone. I know Sophie. I know the charm, the manipulation, the hunger. I once believed she would carry this land after us. I was wrong. I leave it to you, not because you want it, but because you won't sell it. You won't surrender it. You won't let our family's history be bulldozed into dust. Hold steady, little sister. Stand when the world tries to move you. The land will stand with you." By the time I reached the end, my eyes were blurred with tears. But they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were something harder, something steadier. Margaret had trusted me, and I would not betray that trust. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer. Then I whispered into the empty room, as if Margaret could still hear me. "She came for war, but she has no idea who she's fighting." The article spread faster than wildfire on a dry Montana summer. By noon, people at the feed store had already stopped talking when I walked in. By evening, the whispers had reached the gas station, the bakery, even the post office. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes follow me, some full of doubt, some full of pity, and some, the worst of all, full of satisfaction. As if they had always suspected I wasn't worthy of my sister's trust. Sophie's lies had done their work. That night, I sat at the kitchen table. Margaret's letter open in front of me, and I realized silence would no longer protect me. Silence, in fact, was surrender. And I had promised Margaret I would not surrender. The next morning, a knock came at the back door. When I opened it, Clara Jennings stood there. The young reporter I'd noticed at the funeral, her camera tucked discreetly under her jacket. She looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot, but her eyes were steady. "I haven't run the footage yet," she said. I frowned. "Footage." She nodded. "From the funeral. I was recording for a piece on Margaret's vineyard. I caught everything your daughter said." For a moment, I didn't breathe. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a small laptop. On the screen, the video played Sophie standing at the front of the church, her finger pointed at me, her voice sharp and merciless. "This woman is nothing but a parasite." The camera had caught the gasps, the murmurs, the way people turned their faces away from me. Watching it, I felt the shame all over again, but then I saw something else. The truth. Sophie's cruelty was undeniable. No one watching this could mistake it for strength or righteousness. It was venom, plain and raw. Clara looked at me. "Do you want me to air it?" I thought of Margaret's words in her letter, "Stand when the world tries to move you." I nodded once. "Yes, but not yet. Let me add something first." That afternoon, I sat with Ellen Price at her kitchen table. We spread out Margaret's letter, the will, the legal documents Sophie had tried to use, and the petitions Maxwell had already shut down. Ellen tapped her finger on the page. "This," she said, pointing to Margaret's words, "I leave it to you, not because you want it, but because you won't sell it. This is gold, not just legally, publicly. It shows intent. It shows legacy." I folded the letter carefully. "Then let's use it." The following day, Clara returned. Together, we built the story. Not with flourishes or dramatics, just truth layered over more truth. The footage of Sophie screaming at the funeral. The still photograph of Margaret in her vineyard, smiling in her wide straw hat. The line from her handwritten letter, "Because you won't sell it." When Clara finished editing, she looked at me. "Are you sure? Once this goes out, it won't come back." I met her eyes. "Then let's make sure it goes out everywhere." 2 nights later, the video aired on the local station and was shared online. By sunrise, it had already been clipped and replayed across every corner of the county. The clip of Sophie's voice calling me a parasite. The image of her face twisted in anger as neighbors looked away. The words from Margaret's letter, scrolling slowly across the screen. The tide had turned. By noon, Daniel came to me in the vineyard, holding up his phone with a rare smile tugging at his lips. They've seen it, Eleanor. The town's seen it. And they're not buying her story anymore. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I let out a long, shaking breath. This wasn't victory yet. Not even close. But it was the first step forward. The first stone in a wall I would build. Not just for myself, but for Margaret, for the land. And for every memory Sophie thought she could erase. The morning after Clara's report aired, the ranch felt different. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, neighbors waved when they drove by. At the feed store, people no longer turned away. They looked me in the eye, some even offering small, quiet nods. Daniel told me 2 vineyard workers had stopped him in town just to say they stood with me. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but it was air after drowning. Then, by evening, the storm rolled back in. A courier arrived at the front gate with another thick packet of papers. I opened them standing by the kitchen sink, my stomach already twisting. The words jumped off the page. Petition for emergency hearing contesting executor's capacity. Attached were statements, thin, flimsy, but designed to wound. Affidavits from distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, claiming I had grown, withdrawn and erratic. A psychological evaluation from a so-called expert, who had never once met me, arguing I was under emotional duress, incapable of managing a complex estate. Letters accusing me of isolation, paranoia, and diminished judgment. I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles whitened. This wasn't just Sophie clawing for money anymore. This was her trying to erase me as a person. I called Maxwell. My voice was sharp. She's questioning my sanity. He sighed heavily on the other end. I've seen these tactics before. It's desperation dressed up as strategy. Don't let it rattle you. But it did rattle me. More than I wanted to admit. Because when a lie is written on official paper, stamped and signed, it doesn't matter that it's false. It still leaves a stain. That night, I sat on the porch staring out at the vineyard, Margaret's letter open in my lap. Stand when the world tries to move you. I whispered the words like a prayer. The next morning, I found Daniel in the barn repairing a broken latch. I told him about the accusations. His jaw tightened. She thinks she can break you by making people doubt what's in front of their own eyes, he said. Maybe she can, I admitted. Daniel put down his tools, stepped closer, and looked me dead in the eye. Eleanor, I've worked this land beside you for 20 years. I've seen you mend fences in the snow, balance ledgers when the banks were breathing down your neck, and stand at Margaret's side through every season. If that's not capacity, I don't know what is. His words steadied me. But still, I could feel Sophie's shadow pressing closer. 2 days later, Ellen Price arrived again, this time with a folder in hand. She laid it on the kitchen table, her face grim. She's not just filing petitions, Ellen said. She's leaking stories to the press, claiming you're unstable, that the community's future is at risk if the ranch stays in your hands. I stared at the folder, then at Ellen. So what do? Ellen's eyes sharpened. You don't just defend yourself, you expose her. The words hit me like a spark in dry grass. Because Sophie thought she could bury me under paper, lies, and whispers. But she hadn't counted on one thing: Margaret had left more than land. She had left proof, and I was ready to use it. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog of rumors. At the diner, 2 men fell silent the moment I stepped inside. At the post office, I overheard my own name whispered with the word unstable. Sophie's accusations were working their way through the town like weeds. Fast, invasive, choking out what little trust I had rebuilt. But the land doesn't lie. At dawn, the vineyards still glowed with mist, the cattle still bellowed for feed, and the fences still needed mending. I clung to that rhythm like a lifeline. Work had always been the answer to doubt. Then Ellen came. She arrived one crisp morning. Her silver hair pinned back tight, a folder tucked under her arm. She didn't waste time with greetings. She sat at my kitchen table, opened the folder, and slid a stack of printed emails across the wood. I scanned the first page. My hands went cold. The emails were between Sophie and a NADA-based real estate firm. The subject line, parcel division proposal. Dates stamped weeks before Margaret even passed. The words were clear. Sophie had been negotiating to carve up the ranch into private estates, winery resorts, and commercial parcels. She planned to sell it before Margaret's funeral, Ellen said flatly. She never intended to run this land. She only wanted to liquidate it. I pressed my fingers to my temple, nausea rising. How did you get these? Ellen gave a thin smile. Friends in the courthouse still owe me favors. Later that afternoon, Clara arrived, her camera slung across her shoulder. She sat at the same table where Sophie had once thrown contracts at me and pulled out her laptop. I've been digging too, she said. On the screen were screenshots from Sophie's husband's old business ventures. Failed projects tied to the same investors, now circling the ranch. She's using their playbook, Clara said. Run up debts, promise returns, then cash out before it collapses. I leaned back, the room spinning. My own daughter, my blood, hadn't just turned against me. She had planned the betrayal long before Margaret's casket was even lowered into the ground. Daniel came in from the fields just as Clara closed the laptop. His boots were muddy, his shirt damp with sweat, but his eyes were sharp as he looked at us. So now we know. She's not here for family. She's here for the money. Silence fell over the room, heavy, certain. I looked at Ellen. Can we use this? Her voice was steady. Oh yes. In court, in the press, in every place that matters. This isn't just defense anymore, Eleanor. This is offense. That night I sat at Margaret's desk, her letter beside me, the folder of emails spread open under the lamp. My hands no longer shook, my chest no longer felt hollow. For weeks I had been reacting, absorbing blows, standing still like Margaret taught me. But now it was time to move. Sophie wanted a war in the shadows. I would drag her into the light. The town hall was booked months ago by Margaret for the annual Vineyard Appreciation Night. Sophie assumed the event had been canceled after the funeral. She was wrong. I kept the reservation. And on that Friday evening, I walked into the building with Daniel at my side, Ellen carrying a thick folder, and Clara wheeling in her camera equipment. My hands were steady, though my stomach twisted. The room filled quickly. Ranch hands, neighbors, small business owners, even the mayor. All curious, all whispering. A few reporters slipped in, notebooks ready. By the time the clock struck 7, there wasn't an empty chair left. And then Sophie arrived. She was late, of course, making her entrance 20 minutes after the hour. Her heels echoed across the hardwood floor as she took a seat in the front row, legs crossed, a smirk tugging at her lips. She thought she was walking into another chance to sway the crowd, another stage for her performance. But this time, the stage was mine. When the lights dimmed, Clara stepped forward. Tonight, she began, her voice even, we will share the truth of Margaret Hayes's legacy and who it was meant to protect. The screen flickered on. First came the footage from the funeral. Sophie standing at the altar, her fingers stabbing the air, her voice sharp and merciless.
This woman is nothing but a parasite.
The camera caught the gasps, the shocked faces, the way neighbors turned away in shame. Murmurs spread through the hall. Sophie's smirk faltered. Then the video cut to still images. Margaret in her vineyard, smiling in her straw hat. A voiceover read aloud her letter. I leave it to you, Eleanor, not because you want it, but because you won't sell it. The words filled the hall like thunder. Finally, Clara displayed the emails, projected big and undeniable, between Sophie and the Nevada developers. The subject lines were damning. Parcel division proposal. Timeline for estate liquidation. Date stamped before Margaret's death. The silence was suffocating. Then whispers broke out. Sharp, angry. From the back row, one of the ranch hands who had worked for Margaret stood up. His voice shook, but it carried. Mrs. Hayes never would have sold this land. She said it 100 times, we all heard her. And Sophie, you knew it. Others joined in, neighbors, former employees, even the mayor. Voices rising, not in chaos, but in clarity. Sophie stood, her face red, her voice shrill.
This is manipulation, Lays!
She tricked Margaret into changing the will. No, I said, finally stepping to the microphone. My voice was low, but it carried. Sophie, you came here for money. I came back for memory. The room went still. I looked out at the faces. Men and women who had worked this soil, who had seen Margaret's hands blistered from pruning, who knew the truth in their bones. Then I looked back at Sophie, whose eyes darted, whose lips trembled though she tried to hold her ground. You call me a parasite, I continued, but parasites take. I stayed, I worked, I endured. Margaret knew that, and that's why she chose me. There was no applause, no cheer, just the slow, steady sound of people rising to their feet, one by one. A symbolic vote, every hand raised. Support for me as sole steward of the ranch. Sophie's face hardened. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the hall. This time, no one followed. By the time the chairs were being folded away, Clara's footage was already being clipped, shared, spreading across every corner of the county. The tide had turned, the community had seen, and Sophie's war had just begun to unravel. The morning after the town hall, the air on the ranch felt different. Lighter, steadier. As if the vines themselves had exhaled after holding their breath for too long. At the feed store, the clerk handed me my receipt with a quiet nod. "You did good, Mrs. Hayes," he said, not praise, more like permission, a recognition that the community had chosen its side. By noon, Daniel came riding up on his ATV with a rare smile tugging at his lips. One of the investors Sophie bragged about. He just pulled out. Sent a letter to Maxwell this morning. Said they won't touch the vineyard after what came out last night. I felt my shoulders ease for the first time in weeks. It wasn't victory yet, but it was momentum. Then, like clockwork, the other shoe dropped. 2 days later, Maxwell called me into his office. His desk was stacked with fresh filings, thick folders stamped with legal seals. He rubbed his temple before speaking. "She's filed again," he said. "A new petition. This one's heavier." He slid the papers across to me. Motion to appoint independent conservator. The language was sharp, clinical, and cruel. Sophie was accusing me of being mentally unfit to manage complex estate assets, claiming I was prone to erratic behavior and undue emotional influence. She wanted the court to strip me of authority and hand control of the ranch to a third party, someone she could no doubt manipulate from behind the curtain. "She's doubling down," I said quietly. Maxwell nodded grimly. "She knows she can't win on inheritance, so she's trying to erase you instead. If the court buys this, even temporarily, she gets leverage. That's what she wants." I sat back, staring at the papers, heat rising in my chest. "She's calling me incompetent." Ellen, who had joined us, leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room. "Eleanor, don't let this shake you. Courts don't move on whispers. They move on proof, and she doesn't have any." But I knew Sophie. Proof wasn't her game. Noise was. And noise could drown truth if you let it. That evening, I walked the rows of vines alone. The sun was low, painting the fields in gold. I pressed my hand against one of the old posts Margaret and I had set decades ago. It was weathered, cracked, but still holding the line. That was me, cracked, weathered, but still here. Daniel found me there. He didn't ask about the new petition. He didn't need to. He just stood beside me, quiet, until the silence felt like strength again. Then he said, "If she wants to play this game, we'll give her more than noise. We'll give her the truth." And I realized then, we had it. The emails, the contracts, Margaret's handwritten letter, even Clara's footage. Sophie wanted to drag me into court, fine. But she'd be the one standing exposed when the lights came on. Because the truth was on my side. And this time, I wasn't just standing still. I was ready to strike back. The letter came on a gray morning, hand-delivered by a clerk with kind eyes who looked like she didn't want the job. She handed me the envelope, asked for my signature, and left without a word. Inside was the notice an emergency hearing had been scheduled. Sophie's petition questioning my mental capacity was moving forward. The court would decide whether I was fit to remain executor of Margaret's estate. For a moment, I just stood there in the kitchen, the paper trembling in my hand. The silence of the house pressed in. Clovis, the old dog, rested his chin on my knee as if he knew. I called Maxwell.
"It's real now?" I said. "I know."
He replied calmly. "But we're ready. We've got the will, Margaret's letter, the emails Ellen found, Clara's footage. This isn't a trial, Eleanor. It's a hearing. She'll try to smear you. We'll answer with proof." That afternoon, we gathered at Maxwell's office. Ellen was already there, her reading glasses perched low on her nose as she marked up documents with a red pen. Clara sat in the corner with her laptop, replaying the funeral footage frame by frame, making sure every detail was clear. Daniel stood by the window, arms crossed, silent but steady, the way he always was. Maxwell laid out the plan. Ellen would introduce the emails with the Nevada developers. Clara would provide the video of Sophie's public outburst. Daniel would testify about Margaret's intentions and my steady management of the ranch. And I would tell the truth. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat at Margaret's old desk with her letter open in front of me, reading the lines again and again. I leave it to you, not because you want it, but because you won't sell it. I whispered to the empty room, I won't, Margaret, I won't. The next morning, the courthouse smelled of polish and paper. The hallways echoed with footsteps and whispers. When I entered the hearing room, Sophie was already there, seated beside her attorney. She wore a crisp navy suit, her hair smoothed back, her expression sculpted into one of calm concern, like a daughter reluctantly forced to question her mother's well-being. It was a mask. I knew it. She knew it. But the court didn't yet. Her lawyer stood first, painting me as an aging woman overwhelmed by grief, incapable of managing a complex estate of significant value. He spoke of emotional instability, erratic behavior, and isolation from family. Each word was meant to chip away at me, to make me small, to make me vanish. When he finished, Maxwell rose. His voice was calm but carried like a hammer striking steel. He presented Margaret's will, airtight and uncontested. He read aloud the line from her letter, and even the judge leaned forward at that. Then Ellen stood and introduced the emails. Sophie's own words. Dated, time-stamped, conspiring to sell the land before Margaret's death. Finally, Clara played the footage. The room filled with Sophie's voice, sharp and venomous. This woman is nothing but a parasite. The gasps of the funeral crowd echoed once more, undeniable. I watched Sophie's face as it played. For the first time, her jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with panic. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, my palms damp, but my voice steady. Your Honor, I said. I am not here to argue with my daughter. I am here to honor my sister. Margaret trusted me with this land because she knew I wouldn't sell it. Because I was here every day she needed me. Because I stayed when others left. That is not instability. That is loyalty. The room was silent when I sat down. The judge didn't rule that day. He said he needed time to review. But as I left the courtroom, Daniel whispered in my ear, "You won today, Eleanor. Even if the papers don't say it yet." And for the first time since this war began, I believed him. The courthouse hearing had ended without a ruling, but I walked out that day with my head high. Clara's footage, Ellen's documents, Maxwell's arguments. They had stripped Sophie's mask in front of the judge. For the first time in years, I felt like the truth was visible, not just to me, but to the world. But Sophie never surrendered after losing ground. She shifted. She adapted. She struck somewhere new. 3 days later, Ellen drove up to the ranch with a newspaper folded under her arm, her jaw tight. "You'd better sit down for this," she said. The headline hit like a punch. Is Montana's Vineyard Harris losing her grip? The article wasn't from our county. It was from a state-wide paper, one with reach and reputation. And it was brutal. It painted me as an aging recluse, too fragile to manage hundreds of acres, too emotional to make sound business decisions. It quoted anonymous sources, claiming I had been erratic at town meetings, that I often forgot details, and leaned too heavily on outsiders. Worse, it twisted Clara's footage. Instead of highlighting Sophie's venom, the piece suggested the video showed a family tragedy, where a daughter was pushed aside by a mother blinded by greed. I stared at the words until the ink blurred. My chest burned, my pulse loud in my ears. "She's taken it statewide," I whispered. Ellen nodded grimly. "She wants to poison the well. Judges read papers too. Investors, co-ops, even neighbors. They'll all see this." That evening, Clara came by furious. "They butchered my footage," she said. "Cut it, spliced it, framed it to make you the villain. I can release the full video online, but once a lie gets traction." She trailed off, shaking her head. Daniel spoke up then, leaning against the doorframe, his voice quiet but firm. "Let her flood the papers. The land doesn't care. The truth's still here, and people know what they saw at the hall." But I wasn't naive. Lies have long legs, and Sophie knew how to make them run. That night, I sat at Margaret's desk. Her letter opened once more. "Hold steady, little sister. Stand when the world tries to move you." I traced the words with my fingertip and whispered, "I'm standing, Margaret," but the ground's shaking. The next morning, Clara called with a new idea. "If she wants to take this statewide, we will too. But we won't just defend, we'll expose. We have the emails, the contracts, your sister's recording. Let's take it to the public, all of it." Ellen agreed. "If Sophie wants a war in the papers, she'll get one. Only this time, it'll be truth against lies." For the first time in weeks, I felt the flicker of something sharper than fear. Resolve. Sophie thought she could bury me under noise. But she hadn't counted on the weight of proof. The morning the second article hit, I knew silence would no longer serve me. This wasn't just gossip in a small town anymore. Sophie had turned it into a statewide scandal, and if I stayed quiet, her lies would root deeper until no truth could grow. That evening, Clara came by with her laptop and camera, Ellen with her stack of files. Daniel stood at the counter with his arms folded, watching as we laid everything out on the kitchen table. The room looked more like a newsroom than a ranch house. Folders spread open, USB drives stacked, coffee cups forgotten and cold. Clara broke the silence first. "We need a press conference. Simple, public, undeniable." Ellen tapped Margaret's letter with her finger. "Not just words. Proof. Show them her handwriting. Show them the emails. Play the recording." My breath caught. "The recording." Ellen nodded. "You said Margaret left one, didn't she? Her voice matters more than any lawyer's." I hesitated. That tape had been mine alone. Margaret's last words filling the quiet of my nights. But maybe Ellen was right. Maybe it was time to let the world hear the truth straight from her lips. 2 days later, we held the conference at the county courthouse. It wasn't grand. Just a rented room with folding chairs and a podium. But every local station showed up, alongside 2 state outlets. Reporters leaned forward with their pens ready, cameras blinking red. I stepped to the microphone, my heart pounding so loud I thought they could hear it. "My daughter has called me unstable. She has called me unfit. She has called me a parasite. But what she hasn't called me is what I am, the steward of my sister's legacy." Clara dimmed the lights and played the recording. Margaret's voice filled the room. Weak but steady, slow but deliberate. "I leave it all to Eleanor, not because she asked, but because she stayed. She will not sell. She will protect what I built when I no longer can." The room went utterly silent. Even the reporters stopped writing. For a moment, it was just Margaret's voice and the weight of her intent. Then Ellen presented the emails. Printed copies projected onto the screen. Sophie's correspondence with developers in Nevada. Her promises of parceling land. Her timelines for liquidation. Dates, signatures, attachments. All undeniable. Murmurs rose through the crowd. Finally, Clara played the uncut funeral footage. Sophie's voice echoed again. "This woman is nothing but a parasite." But this time, framed by Margaret's letter and the emails, it didn't look like grief or anger. It looked like greed. When the lights came back on, every camera was pointed at me. I looked out over the room, my voice steady. "You've heard her voice. You've seen her words. You know the truth. This land was never Sophie's to sell. It was entrusted to me. And I will protect it. Not just for Margaret, but for every hand that ever worked these fields." Reporters shouted questions, but I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The story was no longer Sophie's performance. It was Margaret's truth. That night, Clara's footage aired across the state. By morning, it had spread farther, shared, clipped, replayed. Not as scandal, as testimony. Sophie wanted a stage. Now she had one. But under the spotlight, it wasn't me who looked small. It was her. When Margaret's voice played through the speakers, the air in that courthouse room changed. It wasn't just a recording. It was like she had returned, sitting among us, speaking from beyond the grave with the same authority she'd carried her whole life. Her words weren't flowery or emotional. They were precise, steady, undeniable. "I leave it all to Eleanor because she will not sell." Reporters froze mid-scribble. A woman from the local paper covered her mouth with her hand. One of the vineyard workers in the back row let out a low, choked sound, and I knew it wasn't grief. It was recognition. Margaret's voice had cut through the noise, straight to the marrow. Then came the emails. Ellen projected them larger than life against the wall. Sophie's name, her digital signature, the time-stamped exchanges with Nevada developers. The words were clinical cold. Parcel division proposal. Projected profit margin. Liquidation strategy. I heard the shift in the room, the low murmur of realization. This wasn't family drama anymore. This was betrayal documented in black and white. Finally, Clara played the uncut funeral footage. The gasps. The hard edge of Sophie's voice calling me a parasite. The camera panning across faces twisted in discomfort. Without context, it might have looked like grief. But framed by Margaret's letter and the emails, it looked like greed wearing grief as a mask. When the lights came up, every eye in the room was on me. My palms were slick with sweat, but my voice came out clear. "You've heard her voice. You've seen her words. You know the truth. This land was never Sophie's to take. It was entrusted to me, not because I asked for it, but because I stayed. Because I worked. Because I would not sell what generations before us had built. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a reporter from the state press spoke, his voice carrying. "Mrs. Hayes, do you fear retaliation from your daughter?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I fear nothing more than silence. Silence is how lies grow, and I am finished being silent." The room erupted, flashes, questions, scribbling pens. But I stepped back from the microphone. My part was done. The truth was in their hands now. That night, Clara's full report aired on 3 local stations. By morning, it had spread across the state. By evening, it had crossed into national headlines. Not framed as a scandal, but as a story, a sister's legacy. A daughter's betrayal. At the diner, the cook came out from behind the counter just to pat my shoulder. At the feed store, 2 ranchers I'd known for years shook my hand without a word. On the street, strangers I didn't recognize nodded to me with something like respect. The lies Sophie had planted were still out there, but for the first time, they were being pulled up by the root. And as I sat on the porch that evening, the sunset spilling over the vineyard, I felt something settle deep in my bones. Not victory. Not yet. But strength. The kind that doesn't come from fighting harder, only from standing still until the storm spends itself. Margaret's voice echoed in my mind. "Hold steady. Little sister." And for the first time, I knew I was doing exactly that. The morning after Clara's report went statewide, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Most calls I ignored. Reporters hungry for another quote, neighbors offering sympathy they'd withheld until now. But one call made me stop mid-step. It came from the Montana Department of Agriculture. The man on the line introduced himself as Deputy Commissioner Harding. His voice was formal, but not cold. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "we've seen the footage. We've read the filings. Your story, it speaks to something larger than inheritance. We'd like to invite you to speak at our upcoming summit on land preservation." For a moment, I couldn't find words. Me, Eleanor Hayes, a ranch widow from Helena, being asked to address lawmakers, ranchers, conservationists. My first thought was that they had dialed the wrong number. But Harding continued. "It's important that people hear from someone living this, not just lawyers and lobbyists. We want your perspective." When I hung up, Daniel was leaning against the doorframe, wiping the dust off his hands. I must have looked pale, because he tilted his head. "What is it?" "They want me to speak," I whispered. "At the summit. About preserving land?" Daniel cracked the smallest smile. "Then you'll tell them the truth, same as you've told everyone else." That evening, Ellen came by to help me prepare. She laid her notes on the kitchen table, as always precise, every page marked with her red pen. "Don't think of it as a speech," she told me. "Think of it as Margaret's voice carried through yours. And Clara, always ready with her camera, promised to record it, to make sure the world beyond Montana could hear." The day of the summit, I wore a plain navy dress and Margaret's vineyard hat. When I stepped onto the stage, the hall was packed. Ranchers in worn boots, lawmakers in pressed suits, reporters with lenses trained on me. My knees trembled, but when I looked down at my hands, I remembered how many fences they had mended, how many winters they had endured. Those hands didn't shake easily. I began simply. "My name is Eleanor Hayes. My sister Margaret left me 250 acres, 400 cattle, and a promise. Not because I wanted them, but because she knew I would not sell them." The room went still. I told them about Margaret's letter, about Sophie's betrayal, about the emails with developers who wanted to carve up the land for resorts. I told them how silence nearly buried me, and how truth set me free. And then I said the words that had been building in me for weeks. This isn't about property. This is about memory. Every acre tells a story, every fence post holds history. And if we let greed decide, we lose not just land, but who we are. When I finished, the room erupted. Not cheers, something deeper. Applause like thunder, long and steady. Even the lawmakers rose to their feet. Later, a rancher from the eastern plains clasped my hand with calloused fingers. "You said what we've all been feeling," he told me. That night, as I sat on the porch with Daniel and Ellen, watching the stars scatter over the vineyard, I realized something Margaret had always known. This fight had never been just mine. It belonged to every voice too small to be heard, every family fighting to hold on to what generations had built. Sophie had wanted to erase me. But instead, she had made me larger than I had ever been. 2 weeks after the summit, I was invited to speak in Boise, Idaho, at a regional conference for sustainable agriculture. I nearly said no. The vineyard was entering harvest season, and the land always came first. But Ellen pressed my hand on the table. "Eleanor, sometimes the best way to defend this ranch is to show the world why it matters." So I went. The hall was smaller than the one in Helena, but it was full. Farmers, students, journalists. I stood behind the podium, told Margaret's story again, and saw faces light with recognition. Some nodded, some even wiped their eyes. When the applause came, I felt the same strength as before. This fight was bigger than Sophie now. But when I stepped off the stage, a young man approached me. Couldn't have been more than 17. Thin frame, eyes dark and sharp, holding a battered notebook in his hands. "Mrs. Hayes." His voice trembled. "My name is Aiden. I think my grandmother knew your sister." I blinked, confused. "Your grandmother?" He nodded, opening the notebook. Inside were yellowed letters, some with Margaret's name on the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. My sister's. I felt my knees weaken. "Where did you get these?" He swallowed hard. "My grandmother was Margaret's friend years ago. But," she said, "there was more. She said Margaret left something unfinished. And before she passed, she told me to find you." The boy's hands shook as he held out the letters. "There's one with your name on it. She said you'd understand." My chest tightened as I took the envelope. The handwriting was older, shakier, but still hers. On the front, "Eleanor. For when the storm comes." That night in my hotel room, I opened it. Her words spilled across the page like a confession. "Little sister, if you are reading this, then Sophie has done what I feared. But there is something else you need to know. Years ago, before she turned away from us, I discovered Sophie had debts I never told you about. Debts tied to people who would not hesitate to ruin this land. I kept it hidden, thinking I could shield you from the storm. But the storm is bigger than both of us. If Sophie fights, you know this, she is not just driven by greed. She is driven by desperation. Someone is pulling her strings." I set the letter down, my hands trembling. This wasn't just Sophie. This was bigger. The developers weren't just opportunists. They were connected to debts, to people Sophie had bound herself to long before Margaret died. For the first time, pity pierced through my anger. My daughter hadn't only betrayed me, she had shackled herself to wolves. When I returned home, Daniel found me standing at the edge of the vineyard, the letter clutched in my hand. "It's not just her," I whispered. "She's caught in something darker." He nodded once, his voice low. "Then maybe the real fight isn't against Sophie. Maybe it's for her." I stared out at the rows of vines, the sun setting behind them, the land glowing gold one last time before the dark. For the first time in years, I felt the story bending, not toward vengeance, but toward something heavier. A reckoning. Because if I was going to end this, I couldn't just defeat Sophie. I had to free her. The letter from Margaret didn't leave my hands for days. I read it again and again until the words burned into me. She is not just driven by greed. She is driven by desperation. Someone is pulling her strings. The truth sat heavy in my chest. It explained everything. Why Sophie was so reckless. Why she filed petitions that had no merit. Why she stirred up the press until even she looked ridiculous. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for survival. And then the phone rang. It was Ellen, her voice clipped urgent. "Eleanor, I need you to come to town." Maxwell traced the developer contracts. They're not independent firms. They're shells, fronts for debt collectors out of Nevada. And Sophie, she owes them more than money. She owes them favors. When I arrived, Maxwell had the documents laid out across his oak desk. Contracts, bank transfers, shell companies with names as thin as smoke. The numbers made my stomach knot. 6 figures in debt, climbing with interest. Sophie had mortgaged her future, and when Margaret died, she thought she could mortgage mine too. Daniel leaned over my shoulder, his jaw clenched. They don't care about vineyards. They care about cash. Sophie's just the middleman. Ellen looked me in the eye. This isn't just a family feud anymore. It's a legal storm tied to people who know how to squeeze every drop of blood from a debt. If we expose them, they'll back off, but Sophie will be ruined. If we don't, they'll keep pushing her, and she'll drag you down with her. I sank into the chair, the weight pressing on my ribs like an iron plate. For weeks, I had fought Sophie as an enemy. But now I saw her for what she really was, a woman cornered. Her pride disguising her desperation. That evening, Sophie came to the ranch. Not in her sharp suits or high heels. Just jeans, hair pulled back messy, face pale. She didn't knock. She just stood at the porch railing, eyes hollow. "They won't let me go," she said quietly, not looking at me. I didn't ask who they were. I already knew. Her voice cracked. "Mom, I thought if I could take the land, if I could sell just part of it, they'd leave me alone. I didn't know they'd push me this far." For a long time, neither of us moved. The silence between us was no longer sharp. It was fragile, like glass. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tell her she'd almost destroyed everything Margaret and I built. But what came out instead was softer, almost against my will. "You should have come to me, Sophie. Before the funeral, before the lies, before the lawsuits." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "Would you have helped me?" I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. That night, I sat at Margaret's desk, staring at her letter and the pile of contracts Ellen had unearthed. If I exposed Sophie's debtors, I could end the threat once and for all. The ranch would be safe. The land would remain untouched. But Sophie would be stripped bare, her reputation in ashes, her future closed off. If I stayed silent, the wolves would keep circling. And sooner or later, they would come for me too. The storm had come, just as Margaret warned. And now I had to decide, would I destroy my daughter to save the land? Or risk the land to save my daughter? The vines swayed outside the window, whispering in the wind, as if Margaret herself was waiting for my answer. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at Margaret's old desk with her letter open in front of me, the words glowing in lamplight. She is not just driven by greed. She is driven by desperation. Someone is pulling her strings. By dawn, I had made my choice. The land would not fall, and neither would Margaret's name. That morning, I called Ellen and Maxwell. "We'll go public," I said, "not just about Sophie. About the men behind her." Maxwell didn't blink. "Then we hit them where it hurts. Paper trails and exposure. If the debt collectors are hiding behind shell companies, we strip the mask." Ellen leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Alina, once we do this, there's no going back. Sophie won't be spared. They'll know she was their pawn, their front." I swallowed hard. She made her choice when she dragged Margaret's grave into it. Now I make mine. 2 days later, the courthouse was fuller than I'd ever seen it. This wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was spectacle. Reporters crowded the aisles, cameras blinking, townsfolk filling every bench. Sophie sat at her table, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. She looked smaller somehow, her navy suit hanging loose on her frame. But her eyes still burned, darting between me and the judge like an animal cornered. When Sophie's lawyer opened, his words were predictable. "My client only seeks fairness. Mrs. Hayes is unfit to manage this estate." Maxwell rose calmly, cutting him short. "Your Honor, the issue is not Mrs. Hayes's fitness. The issue is my opposing counsel's client conspiring to liquidate family land under the pressure of fraudulent creditors." The courtroom buzzed. Sophie stiffened. Ellen stood next, introducing the emails with the Nevada developers, projected onto the screen for all to see. Signatures, dates, numbers. Then she dropped the bomb. Bank records tracing the developers to a debt collection firm notorious for coercion, bankruptcy fraud, and intimidation. The whispers turned into gasps. Finally, Clara played one last clip, the recording of Margaret's voice. This time, she added Margaret's unfinished words from the second letter. "If Sophie fights you, know this. Someone is pulling her strings." The silence that followed was suffocating. The judge leaned forward, his gavel resting between his fingers. "Ms. Hayes," he asked me directly, "do you believe your daughter is acting of her own free will?" I looked at Sophie. For the first time, her eyes broke from mine. There was no fire left, only exhaustion and fear. I spoke carefully, my voice steady. "Your Honor, I believe my daughter has lost her way. But I also believe the land should not pay for her debts. My sister entrusted me to protect it. That's what I intend to do." The judge nodded slowly. Then, turning to Sophie's lawyer, "I've heard enough. Mrs. Hayes remains sole executor. The petitions are denied. And this court recommends referral to the district attorney regarding the fraudulent parties involved." The gavel struck. Final. The room erupted, reporters rushing out, neighbors murmuring, cameras flashing. But all I saw was Sophie, standing rigid as the bailiff gathered the files. She looked at me once, her face unreadable. Then she turned and walked out, swallowed by the crowd. I stayed behind, Margaret's letter still in my pocket. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't even relief. It was survival, and survival always carries a cost. As the courthouse emptied, Daniel touched my shoulder. "It's over, Eleanor," he said softly. But I knew better. The land was safe. The truth had been spoken. But with Sophie, nothing was ever truly over. Not yet. The court's ruling should have been the end. The land was safe. The estate was sealed. The debt collectors had been named, their contracts shredded by the light of exposure. But even when the wolves scatter, the silence they leave behind is heavier than their howls. For 3 days after the ruling, Sophie disappeared. Reporters called me, neighbors whispered. Ellen worried she had fled the state. Daniel told me to let her go, to let the dust finally settle. But on the 4th evening, just as the vineyard dipped into shadow, I saw her. She stood at the far edge of the rows, half hidden by the fading light. No suit this time, no armor of lipstick or sharp heels. Just jeans, a wrinkled sweater, hair pulled back too tight. She looked like the girl I once knew, but hollowed out, carved down to bone. I walked out to her, the crunch of soil beneath my boots the only sound between us. She didn't meet my eyes at first. "You won?" she said, voice flat. This wasn't about winning, I answered quietly. It was about keeping Margaret's promise. Finally, she looked at me. Her eyes were red raw. "You exposed everything. Now I'm ruined. No one will hire me. No one will trust me. I'm the villain in every headline." Her words cut deep, not because they were wrong, but because they were true. I had stripped her bare before the world, the same way she tried to strip me. "You did that to yourself," I said softly. She flinched, then pressed her arms around her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. "I was drowning, Mom. Those people, I owed them more than money. They said they'd come after me after Todd, after everything. I thought if I sold the land, I could buy my freedom. And instead," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, "you tried to buy it with Margaret's grave." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I thought you'd hate me less if I fought for something instead of begging." I stared at her, at the woman who had once been the little girl chasing calves through the pasture, who used to curl beside me during storms. And for the first time, the anger in me softened, not to forgiveness, but to grief. "You could have asked me for help," I whispered. "Not for money. For truth, for strength, for standing beside you. But you chose war, and you chose wrong." Her shoulders slumped. For once there was no calculation in her face, no mask, just exhaustion. "What now?" she asked. I let out a long breath. "Now, you go your way, and I go mine. The land stays. Margaret's legacy stays. But Sophie," my voice broke a little, "you can't stay if you're still the storm." She nodded, slow, like the weight of it finally pressed down. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just whispered, "I'm sorry." It wasn't enough. Not for what she'd done. But it was the first true thing she'd said in years. I reached out, touched her shoulder once, not as forgiveness, as farewell. Then I turned and walked back to the house. From the porch, I watched her silhouette fade into the twilight, swallowed by the dirt road. No goodbyes, no promises, just an ending. That night, I sat at Margaret's desk one last time. I took out her letters, her recordings, her words, and I wrote my own. "To whoever comes after me, this land is not wealth. It is memory. It is bone and sweat and laughter and storms. Protect it, not because you own it, but because you belong to it. And remember, silence lets lies grow. Speak, even when your voice shakes." I folded the paper, slid it into the drawer beside Margaret's. Then I stepped outside into the night. The vineyard breathed around me, alive, steady, eternal. For the first time, I felt peace, not the peace of victory, but the peace of roots finally holding after a storm. The land was safe. Margaret's promise was kept. And though Sophie was gone, she would always be my daughter. A wound, a memory, a choice. I whispered into the darkness. "Goodbye, my child. May you find your own soil to stand on." And with that, the story ended. Not in triumph, not in bitterness, but in truth. Family can wound us deeper than strangers ever could. But legacy is not money, and inheritance is not entitlement. It is memory, and memory must be defended. Sometimes defending it means fighting those we love the most, and sometimes it means letting them go. If my story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been betrayed by the very people you trusted most, or had to fight for something worth more than money? I want to hear your voice. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Telling Story with me, because stories like these remind us that truth, once spoken, can never be silenced.